It was a quiet night in the woods, the kind of peaceful stillness where you can almost hear the wind whisper through the trees. Ethan had always loved nights like this. He'd built his cabin in the middle of nowhere on purpose. No neighbors, no city lights, just him and the forest. As an ex-paramedic who loved to hike, the wilderness was where he felt most at home. But that night, something was different. Ethan was sitting by his cabin's fireplace, reading a book by the warm glow of a fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the branches of tall pine trees. He wasn't used to hearing the forest so alive at night. The wind had a strange feeling to it, almost as if it was trying to warn him. Then, without any warning, the sky exploded. At first, it was just a streak of light, a bright fiery trail that cut across the sky like a comet. But it wasn't just a streak. It was falling, fast and huge. Ethan's heart raced as he rushed to the door, throwing it open. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the object crash somewhere deep in the forest, the glow fading as it disappeared behind the trees. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed his jacket and flashlight, heading straight into the woods. His boots hit the ground with purpose, moving swiftly through the darkness. He'd heard stories of strange things in the sky, UFOs, aliens, but he never thought he'd actually witness something like this. His flashlight cut through the trees, the beam bouncing off branches and rocks. He moved quickly, following the faint trail of smoke and heat. The scent of burnt wood and something else, something metallic, filled the air. As he got closer, he could see the wreckage. It was a crash site, and not just any crash site. This was something otherworldly. The wreckage was like nothing he had ever seen before. The craft was shaped like an elongated oval, with smooth, almost metallic surfaces that gleamed faintly under the moonlight. One side of the craft had smashed into a large tree, splitting the bark, leaving behind a deep gouge. A strange blue glow flickered around the edges of the ship, like a dying firefly trying to hold on to its last moments of life. Ethan moved closer, careful not to step on anything that might make noise. He had no idea what he was walking into, but instinct told him to be cautious. There was a low hum in the air, the sound of something powering down. Ethan shone his flashlight on the wreckage, trying to get a better look. That's when he saw it. A figure, slumped against the side of the ship, barely moving. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His heart started to pound harder in his chest as he rushed over, crouching down beside the figure. He quickly realized it wasn't human. The creature was smaller than a human, with pale silver-blue skin that shimmered faintly under the flashlight's beam. Its limbs were long and thin, and its head was slightly larger than a human's, with a face that was smooth and almost childlike, though it still carried an otherworldly look. The creature's eyes were the most shocking. Large, almond-shaped, and glowing a soft amber, they seemed to be flickering, like a dying light. The thing was barely conscious. Blood, or something that looked like it, was dripping from a deep gash on its side. It was badly hurt, and if it didn't get help soon, it wouldn't survive. Ethan's mind raced. He wasn't sure what this creature was, but one thing was clear: it needed help. His medical training kicked in. He checked the creature's pulse, feeling a faint thrum under its skin. It was alive. Barely. He had to act fast. With careful hands, he gently moved the creature, supporting its head as he tried to keep it steady. "Hey, you're going to be all right," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, unsure if it could even understand him. "Just hang on." He scanned the wreckage, hoping for any supplies or equipment that might help. But the ship was too damaged, and there was nothing around that could offer help. Ethan gritted his teeth. He couldn't leave it here to die, especially after seeing the helplessness in its amber eyes. His mind raced. The creature might not be human, but it still deserved help. It still deserved a chance. With determination, he lifted the fragile being into his arms, using every bit of strength he had. The creature's body was surprisingly light, but the soft, unearthly warmth it radiated sent shivers down his spine. Ethan knew there was no time to waste. The nearest hospital was miles away, and even if he could get it there, the creature's injuries seemed beyond what Earth medicine could handle. So Ethan made a decision. He would take the alien being back to his cabin. He was no expert in alien biology, but he knew first aid, and he had to try. The journey back to his cabin was slower than he would have liked. The creature, still unconscious, seemed to be barely holding on, but Ethan didn't stop. He kept moving, pushing through the dense forest, the moonlight his only guide. When he finally reached the cabin, he was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. He carefully placed the creature on the old wooden table he used for repairs and started looking around his cabin for what he could use. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. How could he fix something like this? Ethan didn't have any alien medical supplies, but he had knowledge. He had a first aid kit, antibiotics, and some basic surgical tools. He had to make do with what he had. He got to work. First, he cleaned the wound on the creature's side, carefully wiping away the blood-like substance, and examined the injury. It was deep. The creature had been hurt in the crash, but there were also strange, almost surgical marks on its body that suggested this might have been a more serious situation than just an accident. Ethan muttered to himself as he worked, "What the hell happened to you?" He carefully stitched the wound with the precision he had learned from years of patching up injuries in the field. As he worked, he noticed something strange. The creature's skin seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It was a soft, pulsing light that seemed to sync with the creature's breathing. He wasn't sure if it was part of its biology or something more, but it was mesmerizing. As the hours passed, the creature didn't stir. It was still unconscious, but Ethan didn't let that discourage him. He set up a small IV drip, trying to hydrate it and keep it stable. He knew he was playing a dangerous game. He didn't know what would happen next, and he didn't know if this creature could even survive Earth's atmosphere, but he couldn't leave it out there alone. "Hang in there," Ethan whispered as he finished the procedure. "I'm not giving up on you." He sat in a chair across from the table, eyes never leaving the creature. He wasn't sure what he was dealing with, or what would happen next, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. The night stretched on, and as Ethan watched over the strange, wounded being, a strange feeling began to settle in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something extraordinary, something bigger than anything he had ever experienced. And so, with the alien girl lying unconscious before him, Ethan vowed to do whatever it took to help her survive. Ethan stared at the strange being lying on his table, her silver-blue skin now bathed in the soft light of the cabin. The fire in the hearth crackled, adding a gentle warmth to the room, but the chill of uncertainty filled Ethan's chest. He had never treated an alien before. Hell, he'd never even seen one. He had done all he could with the limited supplies at his disposal, but now all he could do was wait. His heart beat in his ears as he leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving the small creature. She hadn't moved since he brought her in, and he wasn't sure if she even could. Was she alive? Or was he simply trying to hold on to a sliver of hope? With determination, he lifted the fragile being into his arms, using every bit of strength he had. The creature's body was surprisingly light, but the soft, unearthly warmth it radiated sent shivers down his spine. Ethan knew there was no time to waste. The nearest hospital was miles away, and even if he could get it there, the creature's injuries seemed beyond what Earth medicine could handle. So Ethan made a decision. He would take the alien being back to his cabin. He was no expert in alien biology, but he knew first aid, and he had to try. The journey back to his cabin was slower than he would have liked. The creature, still unconscious, seemed to be barely holding on, but Ethan didn't stop. He kept moving, pushing through the dense forest, the moonlight his only guide. When he finally reached the cabin, he was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. He carefully placed the creature on the old wooden table he used for repairs and started looking around his cabin for what he could use. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. How could he fix something like this? Ethan didn't have any alien medical supplies, but he had knowledge. He had a first aid kit, antibiotics, and some basic surgical tools. He had to make do with what he had. He got to work. First, he cleaned the wound on the creature's side, carefully wiping away the blood-like substance, and examined the injury. It was deep. The creature had been hurt in the crash, but there were also strange, almost surgical marks on its body that suggested this might have been a more serious situation than just an accident. Ethan muttered to himself as he worked, "What the hell happened to you?" He carefully stitched the wound with the precision he had learned from years of patching up injuries in the field. As he worked, he noticed something strange. The creature's skin seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It was a soft, pulsing light that seemed to sync with the creature's breathing. He wasn't sure if it was part of its biology or something more, but it was mesmerizing. As the hours passed, the creature didn't stir. It was still unconscious, but Ethan didn't let that discourage him. He set up a small IV drip, trying to hydrate it and keep it stable. He knew he was playing a dangerous game. He didn't know what would happen next, and he didn't know if this creature could even survive Earth's atmosphere, but he couldn't leave it out there alone. "Hang in there," Ethan whispered as he finished the procedure. "I'm not giving up on you." He sat in a chair across from the table, eyes never leaving the creature. He wasn't sure what he was dealing with, or what would happen next, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. The night stretched on, and as Ethan watched over the strange, wounded being, a strange feeling began to settle in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something extraordinary, something bigger than anything he had ever experienced. And so, with the alien girl lying unconscious before him, Ethan vowed to do whatever it took to help her survive. Ethan stared at the strange being lying on his table, her silver blue skin now bathed in the soft light of the cabin. The fire in the hearth crackled, adding a gentle warmth to the room, but the chill of uncertainty filled Ethan's chest. He had never treated an alien before. Hell, he'd never even seen one. He had done all he could with the limited supplies at his disposal, but now all he could do was wait. His heart beat in his ears as he leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving the small creature. She hadn't moved since he brought her in, and he wasn't sure if she even could. Was she alive? Or was he simply trying to hold on to a sliver of hope? She nodded slightly, her expression softening, and for the first time since he'd found her, he saw something close to trust flicker in her eyes. Over the next few days, the alien girl slowly regained her strength. Ethan kept her hydrated, fed her small bits of food, and checked on her wound every few hours. He did his best to be gentle, despite how alien everything about this situation was. He wasn't a specialist in alien biology, but he had been a paramedic long enough to know that keeping her alive was only part of the battle. She needed rest, care, and time to heal. It wasn't just her body that needed care either. Ethan couldn't ignore the strange, almost haunting loneliness in her eyes. She was from somewhere far away, somewhere beyond Earth, and he could tell she missed her home. Her eyes would often wander to the window, staring at the vast forest outside, as if searching for something. It was as though she could feel the distance between herself and wherever she had come from. At night, when the fire had dimmed and the cabin fell into silence, Ethan sometimes caught her gazing at the stars through the window. He wasn't sure if she understood what the stars were or if she simply felt a connection to them, but there was an unmistakable sadness in her eyes whenever she looked at the sky. "Hey," Ethan said one evening, sitting next to her as she gazed out the window. "You miss home, don't you?" Her eyes flickered toward him, her face unreadable. After a long pause, she nodded ever so slightly. She couldn't speak yet, but there was no mistaking the longing in her gaze. Ethan's heart tightened. He didn't know what to say. How could he help her get home? How could he even begin to understand what she had been through? As the days passed, the alien girl's condition improved. The wound on her side had begun to heal, though it left a faint scar where the skin had been torn open. Her skin no longer seemed so pale, and the soft glow that had surrounded her was now faint but steady. She seemed to be regaining some of her strength, and Ethan was starting to see glimpses of her old self in the way she moved and reacted. One day, while Ethan was cleaning up the cabin, he heard a soft, almost musical hum from behind him. Turning around, he saw that the alien girl was sitting up on the table, her amber eyes focused on him. She lifted her hand slightly, pointing at him. Ethan blinked, unsure of what she meant. "Me?" he asked, pointing to himself. She nodded, her eyes glimmering with recognition. Then she made a soft sound, something between a sigh and a hum. Ethan couldn't make sense of it, but it was clear that she was trying to communicate. "That's right. Ethan," he said slowly, pointing to himself again. "I'm Ethan. And you? Well, you're not alone anymore." The alien girl looked at him with a deep, searching gaze. She didn't say anything, but in that moment, Ethan understood. She was learning. She was starting to trust him. He smiled and went to get some more water for her, hoping this small gesture was the first step toward building something more. The healing process was just beginning, but maybe, just maybe, they could help each other along the way. Nova nodded, her face full of longing and sadness. The path between her home and Earth was clear now, and it looked like there were no shortcuts. Before Ethan could say anything more, the map flickered, the lines of light flashing in rapid bursts. Nova quickly turned the device off, looking around the cabin with wide, fearful eyes. Something had changed. Something was coming. Ethan felt the tension in the air. He didn't know what was happening, but he could see it in Nova's eyes. Someone was looking for her. Then the ground trembled. At first, it was just a small vibration, barely noticeable. But it quickly grew stronger, like the rumble of a distant thunderstorm. Ethan rushed to the window, his heart pounding. He could see something moving in the distance, far beyond the trees, over the hills. The ground seemed to shake with each passing second. And then, through the trees, he saw it, a bright, glowing light in the sky. "No," Ethan whispered under his breath. He knew what it was. It wasn't just a storm. It was a ship. A massive ship descending through the clouds. Nova's face went pale, and she gripped Ethan's arm, her fingers tightening. "They are coming," she whispered hoarsely. "My people. They're here." Before Ethan could respond, there was a loud crash and the ground shook again. Something big had landed nearby, too close. The ship was huge, far too large to be a plane or anything that should be near Earth's atmosphere. It had to be from Nova's people. But why had they come for her? And why now? Ethan's mind raced as he looked around the cabin. It wasn't like he had a plan. He wasn't equipped to face an alien force. He wasn't even sure what Nova's people were capable of. But he couldn't just let her be taken. He had to protect her. "Nova," he said, turning to her. "We need to leave. Now." She nodded, but there was fear in her eyes. She didn't want to leave. But she knew, just as he did, that it wasn't safe here anymore. Without another word, Ethan grabbed his backpack, shoving in a few essentials, his knife, some water, and a flashlight. He didn't have much time. The ship would be getting closer, and soon they would be surrounded. Nova, still weak from her injuries, didn't hesitate. She stood up shakily, holding on to Ethan for support. Her eyes darted toward the window, where the light from the ship was now bright enough to cast shadows on the trees outside. Ethan pushed open the door, leading Nova out into the forest. The air was thick with tension, and the ground still trembled beneath their feet. They moved quickly, following the narrow path Ethan had carved through the trees. His heart raced, but his mind was focused. They had to get away from the ship. They had to survive. As they moved deeper into the forest, the distant rumble of the ship grew louder. But then, something else happened. The trees around them began to move, not in a natural way, but as if they were alive, shifting and swaying unnaturally. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. And as the days turned into weeks, Ethan realized that this strange, unexpected encounter had already changed his life in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. Ethan had always loved the quiet of the forest, the way everything seemed calm and peaceful. But now, everything had changed. His peaceful life had been turned upside down by the arrival of a wounded alien girl, and as much as he had hoped to keep her safe, he knew it wouldn't be long before someone, or something, came looking for her. It all started a few days after Nova had fully recovered from her injuries. That's what Ethan had decided to call her. Nova, after the faint, star-like glow that pulsed from her skin. She was still learning to communicate, but they had begun to understand each other better. Her amber eyes, though still filled with sadness, now sparkled with a flicker of trust. Ethan had no idea how long she had been stranded here or where she came from, but the more time they spent together, the more he realized she wasn't just another lost traveler. She was something far more important, something powerful, and maybe even dangerous. It started with the strange signals. At first, it was just a faint hum that Ethan couldn't quite place. He heard it one evening when he was out chopping wood behind the cabin. It was a strange, almost electric sound, like the buzzing of a distant generator or some high-pitched radio frequency. Ethan paused and listened carefully. The hum seemed to be coming from the sky, faint but undeniable. Nova had seemed nervous that day, her amber eyes flicking toward the trees every few minutes. She didn't say anything, but Ethan could tell she was on edge. It was as if she felt something was coming, something big. Ethan shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just his imagination. But over the next few days, the hum grew louder. It was still faint, but it was definitely there, like an annoying buzz that wouldn't go away. At night, when the cabin was quiet and everything was still, Ethan swore he could hear it clearly, coming from the direction of the forest. Nova had begun to react strangely. She would sit by the window at night, staring at the stars, her body tense, her eyes wide with worry. Ethan tried talking to her about it, but she only looked at him and shook her head. She couldn't explain what was going on, but it was clear she knew something he didn't, and whatever it was, it had her scared. One evening, after a long day of repairs around the cabin, Ethan sat down beside Nova. She had been unusually quiet all day, her head tilted back as she stared at the sky. There was something different about her, something that told him things were about to change. "Nova," Ethan said softly, sitting next to her. "What's going on? You've been acting strange. Is something wrong?" She looked at him for a long moment before finally shaking her head. She seemed torn, like she was trying to decide whether to tell him the truth or keep it to herself. After a few seconds, she reached for a small object attached to her side, some kind of device that Ethan hadn't seen before. It was a glowing bracelet, made of a shiny material he didn't recognize. She tapped it gently, and the air around them suddenly crackled. A holographic map appeared in front of them, floating in midair. Ethan blinked, staring at it in disbelief. It was like something out of a science fiction movie. The map showed a series of star systems, connected by glowing lines that pulsed softly. The area they were in was marked clearly, a small, blinking dot. Ethan recognized the shape of Earth, but the rest of the map was like nothing he had ever seen before. This was a map of space, and it didn't just show the stars. It showed paths that led far beyond Earth. Nova tapped the map again, and the lines shifted, zooming in on one location, far from their own. Another star system blinked to life on the map, much brighter than the others. Nova pointed to the spot, her finger trembling. Ethan's heart sank as he stared at the glowing map. "Is this where you're from?" he asked softly. He didn't stop to find out. He pushed forward, his body moving on pure instinct. As he reached the edge of the forest, he could see the glimmer of water in the distance. The river. They had made it, but the sound of footsteps behind him had not stopped. The hunter was still following him, still closing in. Without thinking, Ethan dove into the river. The cold water hit him like a shock, but it gave him a brief sense of relief, like he had finally escaped. He splashed through the water, moving as fast as he could, the current pulling at him but never slowing him down. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the alien hunter stop at the riverbank, its glowing eyes scanning the area, but it didn't follow. For a moment, everything was quiet. Ethan collapsed on the riverbank, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He was exhausted, but he couldn't let himself rest. He had to find Nova. "Nova," he shouted, his voice breaking the silence. "Where are you?" The river flowed around him, the soft sound of the water a welcome distraction from the chaos that had consumed the forest. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, hoping for any sign of her. And then, through the trees, he saw her. Nova emerged from the forest, her face pale but determined. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had made it. She was safe. Ethan let out a sigh of relief, his entire body relaxing. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking from the effort. Nova ran to him, her hand reaching out to him. Without saying a word, she threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for saving me." Ethan held her tightly, not knowing how to respond. He didn't need to say anything. She had said it all with those 3 words. They were in this together now. Whatever happened next, they would face it side by side. For a long moment, they just stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the riverbank, the sound of the rushing water the only noise around them. But even as they embraced, Ethan knew the danger wasn't over. The hunter hadn't given up. The alien pursuit was far from finished. They had escaped for now, but they were not safe yet. "I won't let them take you," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "We'll find a way to stop them." Nova pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Her amber eyes were full of gratitude, but there was something more there, something that spoke of trust and a bond that had been formed in the heat of their shared danger. "Together," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. Together. It was then that he realized the truth. In the short time they had spent together, they had already formed something that couldn't be broken. They had formed a bond stronger than fear, stronger than the enemies chasing them. It wasn't just a bond of survival. It was a bond of something deeper, something that neither of them had ever expected. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Ethan felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just protecting Nova anymore. He was part of her world, and she was part of his. No matter what happened next, they would fight together. Nova's hand slipped into his, her fingers tight around his as they looked out over the river. The hunter was still out there, still waiting, but they had escaped for now. And together, they would fight to survive. The bond had been forged. There was no going back. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft, silvery light over the river. Ethan and Nova sat quietly beside the water, their eyes scanning the surrounding forest. The tension that had been building over the past few days hung heavy in the air. The hunter hadn't followed them into the river, but Ethan knew that was just temporary. They couldn't stay here forever. They had to keep moving. Nova's hand rested in his, her fingers tightly gripping his, as if she could draw strength from him. They had both escaped once, but would they be so lucky again? The sound of rushing water was comforting, but it didn't mask the nervous energy pulsing through the night. Ethan glanced over at Nova. Her face was calm, but there was something in her eyes that told him she was far from peaceful. She was thinking, planning. She had to be. She knew more about this situation than he did, but he didn't know what she had in mind. "Nova," he said quietly, his voice low. "What happens now? They'll come for us again. They won't stop." Nova turned to face him, her amber eyes shimmering in the moonlight. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing her options. Then, finally, she spoke. "I know they won't stop," she said softly. "They'll keep searching until they find me. But I won't let them take me, Ethan. I won't let them hurt you either." Ethan frowned. "How can we stop them? What are we even up against?" Nova's expression grew serious, and she seemed to be deep in thought. "I'm not sure how much I can explain right now," she said slowly, "but I can tell you this much. The alien who's hunting us, he's not just any soldier. He's one of the elite warriors from my home world. He's part of an organization that tracks down individuals like me, those who have escaped their control. They have a way of making sure we don't get away." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "So, you're saying there are more of them? Worse than the one we've been running from?" Nova nodded solemnly. "Yes, they are relentless. They won't stop until they have what they came for." Ethan tightened his grip on her hand. The weight of her words settled over him like a dark cloud. He didn't know much about these aliens or their technology, but he knew one thing for sure. Nova was in danger, and if he was going to protect her, he had to figure out how to stop these hunters. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the air. Ethan tensed, his body instinctively moving into a crouch. Nova's eyes widened, and she stood up quickly, her senses on high alert. The noise was distant at first, like a soft thrum, but it was growing louder. It was coming from the direction they had come from the forest. "Not again," Ethan muttered under his breath. "We need to move." Nova's face was pale, her expression filled with fear and determination. "It's them. They found us." Before Ethan could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The trees shook as if some massive force was descending from the sky. Nova turned to him, her grip tightening on his arm. They had no time to waste. The attack had already begun. Ethan sprang to his feet, pulling Nova with him. "We need to get to cover," he shouted. They sprinted through the woods, the sound of heavy footsteps behind them growing louder with each passing second. The hunter wasn't far away, and from the way the ground shook, Ethan knew this was no ordinary attack. There was something bigger at play here. They weren't just being hunted anymore. They were being targeted. "Where are we going?" Nova gasped, her breath coming in quick bursts. She was fast, but even she was starting to struggle with the pace. "Just keep moving," Ethan shouted. "We need to find shelter, a place to hide." They ran deeper into the forest, trying to lose themselves among the thick trees and underbrush. But it wasn't enough. The alien hunter's presence was closing in, like a storm moving in from all sides. Ethan could hear it now, the unmistakable hum of technology in the air, the buzzing sound of something far more advanced than anything Earth had ever known. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, followed by a loud explosion. The trees around them splintered as the shockwave hit, sending debris flying in all directions. Ethan and Nova were thrown to the ground, their bodies slamming into the dirt. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he checked on Nova. "Nova," he shouted. She was still there, her eyes wide with shock. She was unharmed, but the blast had knocked her off balance. "I'm fine," she managed to say, shaking her head to clear the dizziness. "But we have to move. He's close." Ethan helped her up, but just as they started to run again, another explosion rocked the forest. This one was even closer, and Ethan felt the heat of it against his skin. He ducked instinctively, pulling Nova down with him as debris rained down around them. The hunter wasn't just hunting them. He was trying to wipe them out completely. Ethan looked around frantically, his mind racing. There had to be somewhere they could go, some way to escape. His eyes landed on a large boulder half hidden by the underbrush. It wasn't much, but it would offer them some cover. He grabbed Nova's hand and pulled her toward it. "Over there, we can take shelter behind that rock," he shouted. They sprinted toward the boulder, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. As they reached it, Ethan pushed Nova behind it, taking a moment to catch his breath. "Stay low," he instructed her, his voice urgent. "Don't make a sound. We have to stay hidden." Nova nodded, her eyes scanning the area. Ethan peeked out from behind the rock, trying to gauge their enemy's position. The alien hunter had stopped, standing still among the trees. Ethan could see the faint glow of his armor through the gaps in the foliage. He was searching for them, but he hadn't spotted their hiding spot yet. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched the alien move. The hunter's movements were precise, almost mechanical. It was clear that this wasn't the first time he had tracked someone down. He was a seasoned professional, relentless, efficient, and terrifyingly skilled. "I'm not going to let him get us," Ethan whispered to Nova, his voice filled with determination. Nova looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude and trust. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "I know you won't," she said softly. For a long moment, they stayed there, hidden behind the boulder, the sound of the hunter's footsteps growing closer. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't stay here forever. The hunter would eventually find them. They needed a plan, something that would give them an edge. And then, as if by instinct, Ethan knew what to do. He had to distract the hunter, lure him away from Nova. He wasn't sure how, but he would figure it out. He wouldn't let this alien take her. "Stay here," he whispered to Nova. "I'm going to draw him away. You get ready to move." Nova looked at him, her expression serious. "Ethan, no. It's too dangerous. You don't have to." "I'll be fine," Ethan interrupted, forcing a reassuring smile. "You just need to be ready. We're getting out of here together." Nova didn't argue. She simply nodded, her hand tightening around his arm one last time. Ethan took a deep breath, then darted out from behind the boulder, making a beeline for the trees. He moved quickly, deliberately, making sure to keep his footsteps light and fast. The alien hunter turned, sensing the movement, his eyes glowing brighter as he focused on Ethan. It worked. The hunter was distracted. But as Ethan ran deeper into the forest, he couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. The real fight was just starting. The night was quieter now, but the silence felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The battle was over. For now, Ethan and Nova had managed to escape once again, but they both knew that the hunter wasn't far behind. They had no time to waste. The alien warrior would keep coming, relentless and determined. They were at a small clearing near the edge of the forest. The moon cast a pale light over the scene, illuminating the exhausted faces of Ethan and Nova. Their bodies were bruised and worn from the days of running, hiding, and fighting. Yet there was an undeniable bond between them now, one forged in danger, trust, and survival. Ethan looked at Nova, his heart heavy with unspoken words. He didn't want to say it, but he knew what had to happen. Nova was in too much danger, and the only way to keep her safe was to let her go. They couldn't keep running forever. They couldn't stay together if she was always a target. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice quiet but serious. His heart ached with every word. Nova turned to him, her amber eyes filled with both concern and understanding. She could sense the shift in the air. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it from Ethan still stung. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan looked down, struggling to find the right words. He knew this was going to be the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was for her safety. He had to do this, even if it broke both of their hearts. "We can't keep running, Nova," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "The hunter will find us. He won't stop. And as long as you're with me, you'll be in danger. I need to let you go." Nova's face fell, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between them crackled with tension, and the reality of what he was saying sank in. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. "Listen to me," Ethan continued, stepping closer to her, his voice firm but full of emotion. "I care about you more than you can understand. But right now, the only way to keep you safe is if we separate. I'm putting you in danger just by being here. If you go, they won't be able to track you anymore. You'll have a chance." Nova took a step back, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed his words. She shook her head slowly, unwilling to accept what he was saying. "No," she said firmly, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't make me leave. We're in this together, Ethan. I'm not going anywhere without you. I won't leave you to fight this alone." Ethan's heart clenched at her words. He knew she was strong, brave, and determined. But that was exactly why she was in danger. As long as she was with him, they would never have the chance to escape. The hunter wouldn't stop until he had her. "I'm doing this because I love you," Ethan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The words came out before he could stop them, but he didn't regret them. "I want to protect you. I want you to be safe. And I can't do that if we keep running together." Nova's eyes softened, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at him. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling as if she were about to say something. But the words didn't come. She took a deep breath and looked away for a moment, her gaze fixed on the dark outline of the forest. She knew he was right. She had known it all along. Ethan reached for her, his hand brushing against her arm gently. "Please," he whispered, "you have to trust me." Nova turned to face him again, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't want to leave you," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this separation, but I understand. You're doing this for me." Ethan nodded, his chest tight. "I have to. I want you to be free. I don't want you to keep running forever." Nova closed her eyes for a moment, collecting herself. When she opened them again, she took a step toward him, her gaze unwavering. "I don't know how to say goodbye," she whispered, "but maybe this is the only way." Ethan swallowed hard. The finality in her voice was almost too much to bear. The pain of letting her go was unbearable, yet deep down, he knew it was the right choice. She had to survive. They both had to survive, and they couldn't do that if they were constantly on the run. "I don't want to lose you, Nova," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You won't," she replied with a small, bittersweet smile. "I'll never be far away. I'll always carry you with me, in my heart. And maybe one day we'll find each other again. But for now, we have to do this." Ethan pulled her into an embrace, holding her tight, as though he could somehow keep her with him forever. But the reality of the situation was clear. Their time together was running out, and they both knew it. They couldn't stay here much longer. The hunter was still out there, and their only hope was for Nova to leave, to find a place where she could hide and be safe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just held each other, silently grieving the loss of something they had only just begun to understand. They were saying goodbye, not just to each other, but to the future they had dreamed of. A future together. "Promise me something," Nova said after a while, her voice soft but serious. "What?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll survive. You'll keep fighting. You'll keep living." Ethan pulled back slightly to look at her, his eyes searching hers. "I promise," he said, his voice steady. "I'll keep fighting. For you." Nova smiled, a small, sad smile, and then, without another word, she turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Ethan watched her go, his heart breaking with every step she took. He couldn't follow her. He couldn't keep her with him. This was the only way to keep her safe. As Nova vanished from sight, Ethan felt a sense of emptiness settle over him. She was gone. The one person he had come to care for more than anything was leaving, and he had no idea if he would ever see her again. He stood there for a long time, the weight of the moment sinking in. The hunter was still out there, but for now, he felt strangely calm. He had done what he needed to do. He had let her go. But deep down, Ethan knew that the fight wasn't over. He would keep his promise to Nova. He would survive. He would keep fighting. And maybe, just maybe, one day, their paths would cross again. With a heavy heart and a determined mind, Ethan turned and started to walk in the opposite direction. The night was still. The forest was silent. But in his chest, there was a fire that couldn't be extinguished. He wasn't done yet, and Nova wasn't either.